Good afternoon. My name is Maureen Jiang. I'm with the Political Science Department and also with the Asian World Center. And I want to thank you all for coming to this great talk from a friend that I befriended a few years ago when I was in Washington, D.C., joining the Department of Defense Strategic Modern Assessment Conference in the Anderson Air Force Base. At that time, we had a great talk, and I decided James has to go to Creighton if he would do his talk. I'm so happy that what we say came true today. The topic, as you already know, is China's use of armed coercion to win without fighting. Jim Stevens leads the defense strategy and planning project at the Stimson Centers, Reimagine U.S. Grand Strategy Program. He is the editor of the recent study, the book that he basically joined the authors for almost every chapter. This is a great book. So I'm going to use it for my Politics of Asia next semester. And then Jim will offer you some good way to get a copy from Stimson Center. His work analyzes China's strategic use of military and paramilitary forces to exert influence without escalating into full-scale war. Jim also contributes to Stimson's cyber and Russian programs, with research focused on grand strategy, military coercion, and gray zone conflict. A term member at the Council on Foreign Relations, Jim holds a master's degree in international affairs with a focus on global security from American University. This timely lecture will provide an in-depth look at the complexities of China's evolving military strategy and its implications for global security. I would like to mention that the Asian World Center thanks to the University Committee on Lectures, Films, and Concerts, and also thank for the Department of Political Science and Father Reverend John Schlegel's Distinguished Professor of Government and Politics, and also the Nebraska Warfare Council. Once again, thank you so much, and please join me in asking Jane to give a great presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Thank you very much for coming out today. And thank you especially to Professor Jiang for the invitation and to the Political Science Department for hosting me here at Creighton University, and also to the Nebraska World Affairs Council. It's a pleasure to speak with you all and to share a little bit about the work that I do at the Stimson Center. Make sure that the click works, and it does. So I'm going to speak with you about the edited volume that I've recently completed, which looks at how China has employed its armed forces, military and paramilitary forces, for purposes of exerting influence and trying to shape its security environment and shape the behavior of other countries. So my work at Stimson is really focused on the role of military force in great power competition, which is to say its function in supporting or advancing foreign policy aims short of war. Ideally, that is to say. So over the past few years, I've conducted what I think is one of the most comprehensive studies that's out there to date, looking at specifically how China's used its armed forces for purposes of coercion below the threshold of sustained armed conflict. So the result is the book, China's Use of Armed Coercion to Win Without Fighting. Some of you may recognize that the idea to win without fighting is actually kind of borrowing from Sun Tzu's Art of War. It is a reference to a kind of long-standing tradition in China's strategic culture to attempt to shape outcomes without resorting to war. And that war is actually regarded as a kind of failure of politics, fundamentally. But that does not mean that the armed forces can't be brought to bear in peacetime, in political contexts, where it can essentially serve as a tool of signaling intentions, political commitments, and threats, frankly. So I'm going to start today by giving you a little bit of background on this study, including kind of the intellectual origins of the study and the theoretical underpinnings. My apologies to the World Affairs Council folks who may have joined us online, because there will be some nerdy content that will be designed more for political science students, but I will gloss through that content as quickly as I can. And I'll conclude by sharing some of the key findings and kind of analytical takeaways. So, the intellectual heritage of this study really traces in important ways to the work of Thomas Schelling, whose book Arms and Influence pioneered the theory and concepts of coercive bargaining in international security. It also draws on the work of Alexander George, who further developed the concept of coercive diplomacy. And last, but perhaps most importantly, it draws on the work of Dr. Barry Blackman, who's one of the co-founders of the Stimson Center and my former boss, but he's not my current boss, so I don't have to say that he's been very influential anymore, and it remains true. So in 1978, Dr. Blackman published a book entitled Force Without War, co-authored with Stephen Kaplan, that looked at the US Armed Forces as a political instrument. Now that study was originally produced as part of a DARPA study, or what was called ARPA in those days. And so they developed a data set, a classified version of the data set and an unclassified version of the data set, looking at when the United States had employed its armed forces in peacetime for purposes of deterring adversaries from undertaking actions that we wanted to prevent, and also providing reassurances to allies. But a central insight of that book was that a majority of what our armed forces does for the country is not actually fighting and winning the nation's wars. Instead, it is trying to shape the international security environment, and it's attempting to shape the behavior of other states through military signaling to convey resolve, deter behaviors we don't want to see, and to change behaviors that we don't like. So Blackman and Kaplan distinguished between a martial use of the armed forces, which was intended to achieve a desired outcome directly by force of arms, or what Alexander George has referred to as brute force, okay? And they contrast that with a political use of the armed forces, which is intended to influence the behavior of another actor, to shape their choices through what they call demonstrative force, or what Alexander George calls exemplary force. So when used as a political instrument, Blackman and Kaplan write, quote, goals are achieved through the effect of force on the perceptions of the actor, end quote. Now in 2020, there's a longer story here, but I won't bore you with the kind of long version. I'll say that the Department of Defense sort of rediscovered this force without war study and thought this was really what we need to be focused on in the current security environment. And so in 2020, I co-edited a book with Dr. Melanie Sisson and Barry Blackman entitled Military Coercion and US Foreign Policy, the Use of Force Short of War. Now that was a study of post-Cold War US military operations that were intended to advance some specific foreign policy objective against a particular state or vis-a-vis a particular state with clearly defined objectives. Now, I decided to follow that project by undertaking a study of China's use of its armed forces, both to contribute to kind of our general knowledge of this important function of military power, and also to allow some comparisons to be drawn between the ways that the world's two largest military powers employ their armed forces, and what kind of their theory of change is in the employment of the armed forces. I also wanted to establish some kind of common reference points for understanding the sort of successes, failures, the different policy priorities pursued by the two countries during peacetime competition. Obviously, the US and China are not the only countries in the world that use their armed forces to produce psychological or political effects on other states. And so in my view, this is the kind of thinking about the utility of military force that we should really prioritize. This is arguably more germane to great power competition than high-end warfighting, because on both sides, there's an effort to actually avoid that high-end warfighting, but nonetheless, to pursue foreign policy aims and to attempt to deter unwanted behaviors on the other side. So as the war in Ukraine clearly demonstrates, the consequences of modern great power conflict, complete with all the advancements in tools, technologies, and tactics that entails, is simply devastating. And we can imagine the way that such a conflict might unfold between two major powers rather than one middling power and a smaller power. So while our armed forces must be trained, equipped, and prepared to prevail in any variety of potential conflict scenarios, coercion short of war, especially deterrence, should be considered the most important aspect and object of US military strategy, in my view. So what do I mean by coercion short of war? I want to be clear that it's not meant in a sort of a value judgment sense, right? Coercion has a kind of negative connotation, and under, if you were brought into a courtroom and charged with coercion, that would be bad for you, right? But in international affairs and in political science, it's simply the correct term to use for shaping, attempting to influence through the use of threats, the behavior of other states. So we define coercion as an effort to resolve challenges to national interests using demonstrative military force, independently or with other tools of statecraft, to convince the target actor to comply with demands or policy preferences, in short. This takes three main forms. There's deterrence, which is an effort to dissuade, and actually the French translation of deterrence is dissuasion, to dissuade a target from undertaking an action before it has begun. And compellence, which is to coerce a target into taking an action that they would not otherwise want to take. And then there's an in-between category called rollback deterrence, which is to persuade a target to cease and desist some violation of a deterrent demand, to restore the status quo ante, the status quo before they took an action. Now, candidly, I have noticed that there's some loose talk about, loose employment of the term deterrence, both in DC and sometimes in the academy, frankly. It's important to understand that deterrence isn't in and of itself referring to any particular action. When we say deterrence has failed, or is deterrence failing, it's a useless question unless you add in the thing that you're trying to deter. Is deterrence of what failing? Or has deterrence of what failed? Now, my work attempts to impose some intellectual discipline on the ways that we study, understand, and practice deterrence and compellence in order to have a better sense of what tends to work and what doesn't in the international arena as states attempt to advance their agendas or prevent undesirable behaviors. But it's key to understand what behaviors they're attempting to shape or deter. So I do this by using empirical analysis and statistical methods that are developed for social sciences, as well as qualitative methods focusing on historical case studies to kind of trace the process by which different decisions are reached in international affairs. Now, I hope that this work will continue to help us better understand the most important patterns, mechanisms, and contextual factors that may contribute to the success or failure of different coercive military strategies and tactics. This study is intended to be empirically focused, meaning rooted in facts that occurred rather than hypothetical scenarios. And I approached the project with the intention of making it as useful as possible to practitioners and policymakers, especially in arming them with the appropriate context for the crises that are most likely to flare up in the future. In other words, we can learn from what has occurred in recent and distant past about how these kinds of events, because they are often dealing with the same events, just at a different point in the timeline, we can understand kind of the motivations of all of the players involved and the courses of action that they are most prone to undertake. As you'll see, while the key findings relate to China's use of armed coercion in recent decades, much of the analysis actually focuses on how the US can use its armed forces short of war to better achieve foreign policy objectives. So there are a number of technical but important differences between the study I mentioned on US military coercion and the study on China's use of coercion that make it difficult to compare in an apples to apples way the two studies. But for the sake of time, I'll just say that they cover slightly different time periods, and they include different thresholds of armed force for inclusion in at least the quantitative portion of the study. And the reason for that is simply the prominence of China's use of its Coast Guard and maritime militia forces for these coercive operations. That's not something that we saw in the US case. On the other hand, in the US case, we saw lots of examples of higher end operations involving aircraft carriers, bombardment by cruise missiles, these kinds of tactics and operations that China has not undertaken. So they are not directly kind of doing the same types of actions for the same types of reasons, but at a 30,000 foot level, both states are engaged in leveraging their armed forces to influence other actors' behavior over defined issues. So that's why we can apply basically the same inclusion criteria, except for including Coast Guard and maritime militia behavior, and capture a lot of the activity that we're interested in. It's the same theoretical domain. Now, in part to make up for the differences I just talked about, I did include examinations of China's deterrence and coercive diplomacy efforts leading up to its last major conflicts. This includes interventions in Korea in 1950, in India in 1962, and in Vietnam in 1978-79. And we also included a detailed case study on the third Taiwan Strait crisis, even though the cases I've just mentioned fall outside the kind of primary period of interest, which is the 21st century. These cases were included because I think they shed important light on China's use of military signaling and coercive diplomacy, the utility of armed force in China's sort of strategic thinking. So just a rough comparison so you can see the kind of scope of the two studies. We identified 115 discrete actions involving 234 demands in the US case, and in the China case, 203 discrete actions and 467 demands. So we can sort of say there was more activity in a shorter time period, but again, it's not an apples to apples kind of counting. There were instances of much more significant activity in the US study. There were instances of much lower level persistent gray zone coercion in the Chinese case. And most importantly, we defined the inclusion criteria for cases of coercion the same way in both studies. Though, as I mentioned, including actions by China's law enforcement and maritime militia forces. So in order to constitute a case of coercion, we needed to see that there was a movement by some element of the armed forces. That could be a deployment, that could be a launch, that could be an exercise. We needed to see that there was an identifiable target. In other words, that China or the US named the country that they were attempting to influence. And there needed to be a defined political objective or policy objective. Some specific behavior of the target country was identified as the thing of interest, as the concern that they were addressing through demonstrative force. That all gathers together to make up a case of coercion, right? That there was an effort to shape a state's behavior over a particular issue in a particular way through the explicit or implicit threat of military force. Now, in practice, this means we captured actions like troop deployments, military exercises, weapons tests, limited military operations, all of which are identified in China's Science of Military Strategy as quote unquote primary methods of coercion. So long as all these actions met our other inclusion criteria, we included them in the study. And in both studies, we relied on official statements and primary sources to understand what the government's demands were. And we relied largely on secondary press coverage to assess outcomes. How did the states behave afterwards? In order to understand whether or not the target complied with those demands. We also asked the same or similar research questions in both studies. What military actions might be more or less likely to be effective in convincing a target actor to comply? Did it matter if they were pursuing deterrence or compellence, for example? Or did it matter what kinds of military forces were being leveraged to issue this implicit or explicit threat? What policy issues were in play? Perhaps states are more willing to refrain from taking on territorial aggression than they might be from conducting their own military exercises, for example. So there are different issues at play in different cases: economic issues, territorial issues, behavioral issues. We wanted to understand if they were experiencing more or less success in coercing states around different types of issues. And then what effects might structural conditions have, right? Are these closely related economic partners, or are these countries that have very little to do with one another otherwise? One country is much stronger than the other country. These are the kinds of factors that you might imagine would have an impact on how effective threats would be in shaping behavior. We also looked at examples of other levers of state power, like economic sanctions or diplomatic engagement, as tools used in combination with these implicit or explicit threats by the armed forces. So here you can see kind of a breakdown of the targets and the objectives for which China has used its armed forces in the time period covered per our criteria. Just to give you a quick flavor of some of the kind of issues at stake in the period that we looked at. Now, it's important to note that in spite of the variety of policy issues involved in these specific coercive actions and operations, most of China's coercive actions are related to some underlying dispute with its neighbors over sovereignty and jurisdictional boundaries. And so you'll note that the total objective is more than 100% because there are underlying territorial disputes implicit or implicated in some of the other issues at play. This is a map so that you can take at a glance look at the targets of China's use of its armed forces for coercion, mostly because I like maps. But hopefully you can take away some information from that. It's mostly the countries that are on China's eastern periphery. Draw a semicircle. So, how does China think about these concepts that I've just talked about? In China's Science of Military Strategy, they talk about deterrence quite a bit, or Weixi. And it's defined as a strategic activity, quote, for the purpose of achieving certain political goals, to influence an opponent's strategic judgment with the threat or use of military force, end quote. Now, I think it's important to note that China's conception of Weixi is arguably more akin to the way that I use the term coercion to mean both deterrence and compellence. And that's not the way I use it, that's the way Thomas Schelling uses it. And that's because they talk about Weisha referring to both actions taken to prevent an adversary from doing things that China wishes to prevent, but also actions taken to persuade the opponent what ought to be done through deterrence, and demand the opponent to submit to the deterrer's volition. End quote. To me, that sounds like compellence. Reading between the lines and ignoring some of the inconvenient verbs there. So, to study this phenomenon in practice, my colleagues and I gathered detailed information on China's efforts to assert or enforce a variety of coercive demands. For example, when it imposed an air defense identification zone over most of the East China Sea, or much of the East China Sea, I should say, in 2013, its efforts to intimidate Japan over the Senkaku Jiaoyu Islands, especially since 2014, its increasing attempts to counter US freedom of navigation operations conducted near Chinese claimed waters and near disputed features in the South China Sea especially, and its protection of Chinese fishing fleets that were operating in contested waters and inside other countries' exclusive economic zones. Also, the contest with India over the line of control in the disputed Sino-Indian border. And that's just to give you a few of the kind of most prominent examples that you've probably seen in headlines in recent years. Now, aside from Taiwan, the example that's generally raised in discussions of China's gray zone coercion is the South China Sea. Since 2007, China's maritime law enforcement and China Coast Guard vessels have conducted literally hundreds of quote unquote special operations to expel foreign fishermen operating near the Paracel Islands, and also to carry out regular rights protection cruises along China's so-called 9-dash line, maybe 10-dash line now, in the South China Sea. Consistently harassing foreign fishing fleets and vessels operating near contested features while using their sort of superior maritime vessels to protect their own fleets operating in these contested areas, and to control escalation by intimidating the other country's maritime law enforcement vessels, preventing them effectively from upholding their own sovereign legal rights in their own exclusive economic zones. China has also increased the frequency, scale, and intensity of its aerial and naval patrols around contested territorial claims in the East and South China Seas. I will give you a concrete example of how these cases can accumulate into what we call campaigns. And this is something, the concept of campaigning is something that has been incorporated into US military doctrine as a framework for understanding competition below the threshold of armed conflict. And so I think it's important because that was kind of our idea. I'm just kidding. Anyways, in May 2013, so let me back up a little bit. You all have no doubt seen Second Thomas Shoal come up in the news in recent weeks, months, this past year. That's actually not a new issue. It's an intensification of a long-standing issue. And the history of the kinds of friction that we've seen highlighted in recent news coverage goes back at least 10 years or more. So I'll give you a little bit of kind of how we got here by providing that historical context. So in May 2013, the Philippines saw that several Chinese ships, including a warship and surveillance vessels and fishing boats, were patrolling around this disputed shoal, the Second Thomas Shoal. Now, China essentially claims that the Philippines had dispatched a number of ships to the shoal with construction materials to try to reinforce its de facto garrison on Second Thomas Shoal. And that's why they sent this kind of ragtag fleet to go investigate. For context, in 1999, the Philippines beached an old patrol boat on this shoal deliberately grounded it on the shoal, and it's been sitting there ever since. They have crew manning that grounded vessel. They basically live there and they rotate. So it's basically an outpost on this sandy bank. That's the thing that China is mad about, just for context. The Philippines lodged a protest with the Chinese embassy in Manila over this new patrol route. And then the following day, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs came out and said, Renai Reef, which is the Chinese term for the second Thomas Shoal, is part of the Nansha Islands. China has indisputable sovereignty over the Nansha Islands and their adjacent waters. It is beyond reproach that Chinese government vessels carry out normal patrols in relevant waters. China urges relevant countries to follow through on the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. Sometimes that's abbreviated as DOC. This is an agreement by which parties who have claims in the South China Sea, Paracels and Spratly Islands, have basically agreed not to undertake unilateral changes in those areas. And so that's the thing that China is mad about, going back to the beaching of this vessel. But that vessel was beached before this Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea was agreed to. Okay, so that's critical context. What China now says is the change in the status quo that they're objecting to is the deployment of construction materials, building materials to try to maintain this rusty old tub on the sandy bank, okay? China's essentially waiting for this ship to rust away, the hull to collapse, and for it to just sift into the sea. But that won't happen if the Philippines is able to bolster the hull, make repairs, maybe even build onto it to make a more permanent emplacement, which China regards as a unilateral change to the status quo of that shoal. So, on May 30th, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs reiterated China's stance and then again urged the Philippines to avoid taking further provocative action. The Philippines proceeded to contract out the resupply of water and basic food to civilian ships rather than sending government ships to resupply this garrison, so as to kind of take down the tension a bit. And to avoid further confrontation, it did not reinforce the outpost on the shoal for the remainder of 2013. It stopped sending building and construction materials. Now, the Chinese ships maintained their patrol for several months afterwards, but decreased the patrols over time and eventually departed the area. However, the Philippines did not accede to China's demand that they negotiate to resolve this issue. Instead, it continued with its arbitration claim under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. The next year, in February, Chinese surveillance ships again began continuous patrols around Second Thomas Shoal, and a Chinese naval vessel was allegedly sighted hovering nearby. In March 2014, two Chinese Coast Guard ships intercepted two Philippine civilian contractor ships that were resupplying the shoal and caused them to turn back using intimidation tactics like sirens and megaphones. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that the Philippines had the, quote, aim of building facilities and maintaining a presence, end quote, on the shoal, and that China would never allow the Philippines to, quote, seize the Second Thomas Shoal. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson again claimed that the Philippines had violated the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea and described its actions as a, quote, necessary response to what it saw as violations. In March, Manila received its first open gesture of US support. The State Department criticized China's actions as provocative and said that they were interfering, quote, with the maintenance of the status quo, end quote, right? The ship's already there, that's the status quo. You can't stop the ship from being there. And they said that the outpost had existed since before the 2002 declaration. In late March, US aircraft, including P-8 Poseidon, conducted overflights as the Philippine Navy sent 2 resupply ships to the shoal. And this time, they also brought foreign journalists aboard those ships. The China Coast Guard vessel came within 70 yards in an attempt to stop the supply ships, but ultimately those ships reached the shore and were able to deliver their goods. This was the first time that we can document harassment of a resupply ship to the shoal that China did not accuse specifically of bringing fortification materials. In this instance, we can speculate that it's because they were now conducting resupply using the Navy again, right? It was not these civilian contractors. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs complained that the resupply mission was an arrangement of the reporting trip. Basically, they were complaining about the fact that the Philippines had brought journalists along in what they called a deliberately schemed activity, right? Because this was also the day that they had made their complaint to the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague to deal with the UNCLOS arbitration. So, Philippines employed a kind of a public information element in this approach to shine light on the fact that they were being harassed by the Chinese Coast Guard. And so China complained about that. They didn't appreciate having that scrutiny. But it continued to stick with the narrative about China will not allow the Philippines to build facilities on the reef in violation of the declaration of the parties, conduct of parties. Also in late March, President Barack Obama expressed his opposition to any use of force at the shoal to President Xi Jinping directly. Meanwhile, the Philippines continued to conduct these resupply missions to the islands. And China shadowed the resupply missions, but it didn't harass them this time. News reports later confirmed that the Philippines successfully brought basic building supplies to Sierra Madre over the course of 2014. And China has since maintained patrols around the shoal to present day, but there was no direct negotiations over the sovereignty issue between Philippines and China. And you may have seen most recently that the Philippines has essentially declared that these shoals are under the Philippines administration. And so if I was a betting man, I would say that we're going to see more of a response from China in the coming weeks than we've seen in the prior weeks, because the Philippines has taken another unilateral action that it will say is in violation of this TMC, right? So this is a perhaps long version of the story to just give you context for what you've seen recently in the news and what you're going to see, I would predict, in the coming weeks with regard to harassment of Philippine vessels around Second Thomas Shoal. It is all related to the establishment of this permanent or semi-permanent occupying presence on the shoal. And it's related to this declaration on the conduct of parties agreement that China is accusing the Philippines of violating. Now to the nerdy part, if you can believe it. So to make sense of the trends and the patterns that we saw across all of these 200 some cases, we wanted to engage some political scientists, Dr. Barnett Coven and Dr. Katie Lindquist, to use sophisticated statistical models to analyze the data set in order to provide kind of a objective analysis of significant statistical relationships between variables of interest and China's ability to achieve its objectives. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about methods here, so don't worry. But in essence, these statistical techniques were adopted from the randomized control trial model, right, which is the gold standard in medical research. But this time in real world settings where we can't control the assignment of different policy interventions. Essentially, what we looked at was, in this case, this treatment was introduced. In this case, there was no treatment introduced. How do we compare the two cases how do we compare the 200 cases based on the difference of those variables of interest. Now that's to control for the fact that the PRC's operational strategies are not really applied at random, right? They are applied deliberately, thoughtfully, oftentimes. But by controlling or comparing what's called matching different events that are fairly similar to each other on important dimensions, we can essentially confidently and accurately assess the impact that different policy interventions might have, holding other variables equal or controlling for other variables in the model. This matching technique computes the average treatment effect based on as many relevant observations as possible, and it gives greater weight to those that are most those observations that are most closely matched to one another. So this figure visualizes the resulting calculation of this average treatment effect. I want to note that there is no y-axis, there's no vertical axis, so don't be confused by looking for where these things fall vertically. We're only talking about, is it left of the line or is it right of the line? The line is zero significance. So right of the line is a positive association, left of the line is a negative association. As you can see, deterrence is positive, which reflects the fact that China's been more successful on average when it uses deterrence compared to when it uses compellence or rollback deterrence. This depicts kind of a tendency for China to fail in compellence and rollback cases. I'll just note for your awareness that the lines that come out of the dot is kind of the best estimate, and the lines that come out represent the confidence interval. So as long as the lines don't, as long as these kind of whiskers that come out from the dot don't cross that zero line, then it is statistically significant, which is to say that all three of these different strategies were statistically significant, and deterrence is significantly positive relative to compellence and rollback. Here you can see some of the other kind of strategies that we tested for, including the use of patrols, recurring or regularized patrols, and aggressive interceptions, what we call interposition, as well as the use of diplomatic direct negotiations or threats to use force. I should point out that we collected data on literally dozens of variables, but only some of those were ultimately included in the analysis. We also used additional statistical models to assess the effects of variables that were less conducive to this matching technique I described to you, such as military expenditure, big military budgets versus small military budgets versus in-between military budgets, the volume of trade, the size of the forces that were employed on both sides, and the specificity of the demands being made. But here we can clearly see that recurring patrols have a negative effect, but one-off patrols have a positive effect, perhaps indicating that those one-off patrols were perceived as more significant somehow than a more routine, regular action. But we've seen also that that kind of persistent presence may not win the battle, so to speak, but it does have a corrosive effect over time. So I don't want to overinterpret the negative association with recurring patrols. Across the board, the results show that on average, all else being equal, China tends to be more successful at deterrence and tends to fail at both compellence and rollback deterrence. China has also been more successful coercing militarily weaker states compared to stronger states. And we'll let that soak in for a minute because that's a very intuitive finding. Okay. China has also been less successful at coercing states that host more US forces. It has been less successful at coercing states with which it has higher levels of bilateral trade. That's interesting. We are currently undertaking an approach of economic de-risking and a coordinated strategy of reducing allies and friends' reliance on trade with China. But I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that that is also, in a sense, giving up some leverage in terms of economic interdependence that the US and its partners may have in influencing China. In other words, there may be limits to the types of coercive behavior that China is willing to pursue vis-a-vis its most important trading partners. And that as these trading partners become less significant, maybe that loosens those concerns. China's also been less successful at achieving territorial concessions compared to other types of policy objectives that it has pursued. It's also worth noting that some of the more common operational approaches that China undertakes, such as regularized presence operations and aggressive interceptions, are associated with policy failure. Right, so that indicates that some of what China is engaged in is actually counterproductive. Actually, it's not achieving the aim that it's trying to achieve. And then we can see that there's also a political cost to those actions. This is some of the findings that I've just mentioned are actually pretty consistent with kind of the expectations in IR theory. Economic interdependence being a source of stability for one, deterrence being easier than compellence for another. It is also consistent with the findings from other kind of related studies on this same topic, such as Rand's recent study on competition in the gray zone, which found that, among other things, China tries to tailor its tactics to its specific target and concentrates tactics on protecting its core interests, such as territory, and that it's cautious in using gray zone tactics against more capable targets, i.e. militarily powerful countries. So I would argue that all of this indicates that resistance works, that despite China's regular presence patrols, they have not been able to dissuade these much smaller countries from continuing to try, at least, to extract and exploit the economic resources in their own exclusive economic zones, or to try to protect their fishing fleets from harassment. It's also noteworthy that some of China's highly confrontational actions, such as those that target large numbers of civilian fishing fleets, are generally unsuccessful. Compellence has usually failed. So in spite of China's preponderance of kind of military power relative to these targets of coercion, they have not given way. And yet we see China hasn't generally escalated. It hasn't been sinking these adversary ships on a regular basis, which it could do. So it's generally avoided escalation to violence. This may indicate that China is conscious of the political costs that escalating to violence would have, and that it is essentially attempting to push, but not shove or not punch. Most of China's coercion involves this kind of sustained conflict or contest over jurisdictional rights and economic resources in its periphery. China is trying to assert legal and economic privileges, some of which are not consistent with international law, but it is thus perhaps more susceptible to being countered by public diplomacy. As I mentioned, the case of the Philippines bringing journalists on board, that's something that they've been doing with more frequency. Also, legal countermeasures, such as the arbitration decision, the Philippines has been able to make constant reference to this international finding in its favor, that it does indeed have an exclusive economic zone, and that the features that fall within that exclusive economic zone are administered or are under the jurisdiction, I should say, of the Philippines. That has been the basis for the Philippines' assertion of administrating those features. And that this kind of publicity and this kind of contrast with international law can be leveraged to kind of threaten or impose reputational costs on China for its behavior. where China is violating international law, it can be essentially brought to account in the court of public opinion on that front. But weaker states need the most outside support. That means making them better able to patrol their own exclusive economic zones and enforce their own legal rights. Improve their ability to understand what's happening in their maritime space, right? There's a term of art, maritime domain awareness. Having the ability to detect Chinese fleets before they arrive, or to understand where they are carrying out these maritime occupations is critical. But it's also worth understanding that direct US support may not be the most helpful in all contexts. There have been instances where the US tried to offer some support that was essentially waved off or rejected after the fact by the would-be partner country, because they are not attempting to take sides, the US versus China. They are attempting to manage their own relations with both countries. And so when the US comes and stands behind them, it creates an unwanted impression of alignment. But that's on a case-by-case basis. So this is just a word of caution against thinking, well, the answer is send the US Navy to patrol that area. Maybe, maybe not. It's context specific. So I want to give you a few, I'm going to close by giving you a few broader points that are kind of my takeaways from this study. Okay. First, China's use of coercion in this way is largely predictable. There's not a mystery about what issues China holds very important and is willing to devote security resources towards deterring or otherwise. When China uses its armed forces, it's generally to press its position over well-articulated political positions that it's trying to uphold. That means that its use of coercive diplomacy has largely been limited to overt disputes with its immediate neighbors. It's not generally asserting new territorial claims or kind of making large changes to its claims. It is reasonably well articulating a scope of its claims, and it's generally behaving consistent with the claims that were made by the Republic of China that preceded the People's Republic of China. This makes China's strategic intentions and the means by which it will pursue them largely predictable. That's a favorable circumstance for defenders of the status quo. You don't have to guess where to allocate resources. There are defined grounds. At the same time, we should bear in mind that China views its use of armed coercion as primarily defensive. It may genuinely view many of its ambitions as revanchist rather than revisionist. Using nerdy words, let me just explain. China's trying to take back something that it feels it once had, rather than trying to assert new claims or expand its claims in its view. So that's an important distinction, because I think we in the US tend to view China's goals as aggressive and aimed at creating kind of a China-dominated regional order. There is also an interpretation that China wants to supplant the United States as a global hegemon. I'm not saying that that is or isn't substantiated by the evidence at hand, but I do think it's important to know that China sees itself as sort of defending or reasserting rights and interests that it views as having been trampled by outside powers that were seeking to take advantage of China during a period of weakness. And now that China sees itself as growing strong enough, it sees itself as kind of resuming its natural place in geopolitics. And it's trying to persuade everybody else to kind of accommodate this rise or return to great power status. It's therefore trying to balance assertiveness, being strident about what it says it is entitled to do, and kind of actively defending its claims, with a desire to avoid an excessive geopolitical backlash. It does not want to make enemies of all of its neighbors and drive them into the arms of the United States, for example. Right? To that point, I think it has more recently realized that that is indeed what it's accomplishing through this kind of aggressive or more assertive behavior towards its smaller neighbors, that they feel bullied and they feel the need to at least reach out a hand to the United States or other security partners in the region to show China that they are not alone. They are not going to be isolated and picked on without seeking help. So China sees itself as deterring actions that it views as kind of aggressive or revisionist, like secessionism, or like other violations of its sovereign rights as it defines them. We could put maybe US freedom of navigation operations on that, in that category, right? That China asserts that it has the right to require the United States to provide it with advance notification before conducting operations near its claimed features. The United States says that under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that it is able to navigate international waters as it wants to do. So there's a difference of opinion essentially over what UNCLOS allows states to do. Now, in recent years, China has consistently expressed an ambition to be viewed as a responsible power. It has historically viewed itself as a provider of international order. And it's traditionally sought to justify uses of military force through diplomacy and policy. This is something that the US might be able to use, actually, to restrain China's behavior through a combination of balancing and institutional entanglement, getting China to agree to things that it won't do, and then making reference to those things. China's persistent reference through the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea is perhaps an example of China leveraging these international accords when it's convenient for it to do so. So perhaps the other side should leverage those international accords more effectively to hold China to account for its behavior. China has also tried to establish a reputation for deterrence or for credibility. It wants to have a reputation that it will respond forcefully when its interests are challenged. And so it's cultivating that reputation by, in real time, responding to challenges. At the same time, it's consistently placed importance on demonstrating its willingness to use military force to defend its claims or assert its will, and then and thus it tends to calibrate the kinds of force that it uses to teach a lesson to others. It's not simply attempting to shape the Philippines' behavior or Malaysia's behavior. It's attempting to set an example for others in the region to understand how China would respond in their contexts. Now, this was a factor in China's decision to use force in its most recent wars, which is borne out in the case studies that we did in this book, that when China repeatedly threatened in an effort to compel another government to take certain actions or to refrain, to deter a government from taking certain actions, it proved in each of these instances that when pushed too far, it was willing to engage in war in order to make its point and to have its way. So I think that has sort of significant implications for our understanding about China's shows of force targeting Taiwan or clashes along the contested border with India. The strategic aim of these kinds of demonstrations of resolve extends beyond the immediate targets. It's trying to use punitive operations to set an example for others and to deter other would-be challengers in different contexts. So my advice is that China's approach has thus far proven to be largely self-defeating, at least in terms of its political objectives. Its reliance on coercive tactics has generated significant geopolitical backlash already, and that's a trend that is continuing. It has not succeeded in gaining formal acceptance or recognition of its claims to exclusive economic or territorial rights in the Spratly Islands, which were roundly rejected by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And it still contends with frequent violations of its claimed jurisdictional rights by other countries, even much weaker countries. Other claimants have not given up defending their own positions. So rather than cowing its smaller neighbors into submission, China's efforts have arguably led to an increase in resistance and balancing behavior in the region, including through increased regional defense cooperation with the US and multilateral repudiations of China's behavior. It has generally avoided escalation when possible and prefers using gray zone tactics to intimidate weaker states rather than seeking outright military domination. When confronted, especially by stronger powers, China has more often opted to back down rather than escalate. And it essentially prefers to regroup and try again, hoping to gradually erode or simply outlast resistance. These insights go a long way to explaining China's preference for gray zone coercion and seeking to avoid escalation. It wants to deter challenges, punish violations, and avoid escalation without creating geopolitical backlash and reputational harm. In China's narrative, it still wants to have productive diplomatic relations with all of its neighbors, and it considers diplomacy, order, and trade as its highest priorities. In late 2022, Foreign Minister Wang Yi declared that, quote, any attempt of conflict, confrontation, containment, and decoupling runs against the prevailing trend of our times and is doomed to fail. Peace, development, cooperation, and win-win represent the popular will of the people and are an international trend, end quote. Now, I would argue that the US can actually take advantage of this framing by prioritizing the diplomatic, informational, and legal elements of its approach to countering China's coercive behavior, focusing on maximizing the political costs of coercive campaigns by China. Importantly, the fact that China has been reluctant to escalate thus far does not necessarily indicate that it can be coerced into simply abandoning these claims, okay? Nor does it indicate that it would not escalate in response to clear violations of core interests and deterrent demands. China uses its coercive force opportunistically, and it is poised to take advantage of these kinds of violations as opportunities as they present themselves. I think it's significant to understand the visit by former Speaker Pelosi in this context. It provided China with an opportunity to escalate toward Taiwan, and China has not backed down from that. It has taken advantage of the context that gave it an excuse to raise the level of pressure against Taiwan, and that has set a new bar, that has set a new normal. So Taiwan is now subject to a higher level of persistent coercion than they were before the visit. Was that helpful or hurtful? You can judge for yourselves, but I think you can also see where I stand. The opportunities that China takes advantage of to kind of dial up are something that we should keep an eye out for and try to avoid when they are not truly necessary. I will close by sharing an important quote from then Senator Biden during the 1999 debate over what was then a bill called the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act. President Biden cautioned against the act, saying that, quote, there is no single issue with greater potential to bring the United States and China into conflict than Taiwan. And a surefire way to spark such a conflict is for the US to reinforce the growing perception in Beijing, however mistaken it may be, that the United States is hostile to China or pursuing the fragmentation of China. End quote. So as these recent crises around Taiwan have demonstrated, China is increasingly willing to exploit opportunities to hone its military competencies and to test or attrit its adversaries' readiness and to make example of these challenges. Thus, when we're seeking to reassure targets of China's intimidation tactics, the US should also be careful to avoid actions that provide China with avoidable excuses to escalate. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Questions?
So I wondered how far back, do you think China's, if they have this belief in territory or geopolitical, area, how far back do they see as their territory? How far back would they go? I mean, it's a similar question I would have about the Middle East. How far back do you say it's yours?
What John Rawls calls the infinite regress, right?
Yes.
That's a very good question. I would say 1940s Republic of China maps are the easy go-to standard for territorial claims, although there are assertions about, northern Mongolia and these sort of places. There's a territorial dispute with North Korea, for instance, that goes back to 600 something AD. So, there are a variety of answers to that question. I think we see most frequent reference to Republic of China territory.
And so it's in terms of the maritime, the islands north of Japan, the conflict that's there, and
Yep.
then the Philippines. Is that included in that 1940? Okay.
Yep. This is one of the stranger things actually about this is the fact that Taiwan is largely in agreement, formally speaking, about the scope of these territorial claims. And has, for example, sent ships to protest the Japanese nationalization of the Senkaku Islands. They don't disagree. But in terms of, so there's a difference between Taiwan's current understanding of its sovereign claims as the current manifestation, let's say, of the Republic of China versus the formal constitutional historical scope of China. And in that historical sense, they agree with the PRC in terms of the scope of China.
And that includes that India-Tibet border.
Yes.
dispute.
Yes, exactly right. So the McMahon line, which was a British colonial cartographer, drew where India ended in the north. China was, I think it was the Qing dynasty, yes, was consulted. But PRC says that they did not sign, did not agree. It's not a recognized border for them.
Right.
So there's fundamental disagreement about whether that frontier, whether that border was properly demarcated in agreement between the government of India and the government of China, because the government of India was the British Empire and the government of China was the Qing dynasty, which was may or may not have been consulted but did not agree.
So I think because the base didn't get fully operational until about 2017, so it may have been too new. But how might your study be changed if you considered the Djibouti base, especially with Wang Yi's most recent tour on the continent was all to coastal African countries, very interestingly, and, questions of a second Chinese base.
Yeah, so China's development of overseas bases is not really dealt with in the study, other than in the penultimate chapter, which deals with military operations other than war, where we're really looking at how China has kind of developed an understanding of far seas operations and overseas operations that it can justify. So it has had historically a kind of a aversion to the use of force abroad. Sort of tries to stand on the principle of non-interference in the affairs of other states. And so sending troops to another country is a rare thing and something that's undertaken with a lot of caution. So in these overseas kind of port access agreements, it typically is fronted as a kind of commercial venture, right? That China will administer the port, build it out so that it can put through higher volumes of commercial traffic. And there might be like a private security company there that helps to provide security. And by the way, in an emergency scenario, we might need the Navy to stop off there to refuel or whatever, right? So there's a kind of a backdoor military component to some of these agreements. Djibouti is very rare, unique even in its military nature. And that was established in part in support of the first major maritime security, international maritime security operation that China undertook in the Gulf of Aden, which was an international thing. They've sent troops to peacekeeping operations, and so they have genuine need for a sustainment logistical hub to support those operations. So that's kind of, we talk about the ways that China has evolved in its thinking of the need to be able to project force far from its shores and to sustain forces in the field in the context of military operations other than war. Not invading other countries, but sustaining its forces in these kinds of multilateral or multinational operations.
I was curious, how do you define peace? Because I'm a little confused, and maybe it's because I'm new to this concept, but we were talking about, or it seemed like coercion is a large part of how we conduct foreign policy, and I think you had stated a little earlier, and correct me if I'm
In
wrong.
peacetime,
Right,
Yes.
is that coercion can propel a lot of the goals that the US has towards their foreign policy, but is it not a little contradicting when we're using coercion? Because it's more of like you're using the manipulation of fear, so it seems. And if we praise the goal of peace, it seems contradicting to rely on a method where you're drawing out the fear of others in a nation and their safety, but you're praising a future where, that's where I'm confused. So I wasn't sure is what you defined as peace in terms of how we're using coercion.
this is an important philosophical question, but also a policy question. And there is definitely an appreciation now that the war peace kind of concept as a bifurcation is not really relevant anymore, or may not be relevant anymore, because of the amount of friction that exists below the threshold of sustained armed conflict. And that's the answer to your question, not sustained armed conflict. But, you know, an act of war would be the assassination of Soleimani in Iran. That's an act of war. Using violence to kill the citizens or public servants of a foreign country on foreign soil. what could be more definitionally an act of war? And yet that does not place the United States at war with Iran in a formal sense. There's been no declaration of war. So states used to be a little bit more orderly and formal about, they would mail each other letters to say, now I am at war with you. You know, gird yourself. That doesn't really happen that way any longer. But that doesn't mean that there is not sustained armed conflict, right? So I would suggest that the frequency and intensity of violence is the measure of war for our functional purposes, and that in this context, peace is the absence of violence. That's different from philosophical debates that people might want to have about, you know, a just peace or positive peace. That's a different kind of conversation. But for purposes of coercion, it's probably worth noting that it's technically not consistent with international law to threaten military force against another country. But it happens very regularly. It is certainly a tool of statecraft. So I'm sorry if that's not a complete answer, but I think it's
No,
a,
it helps me understand the,
yes,
thank you.
peacetime as contrasted with wartime defined as sustained armed conflict.
That's perfect. Thank you.
One more question, yeah, please, one question.
What do you think was the effect of the EP3 incident and how did it move needles around?
Yeah. EP3 was a very good learning experience, I think, for both sides. I think that we should remain on high alert that that kind of an encounter can happen again. And just to tell the story very briefly, the United States conducts regular, persistent surveillance flights along China's coast. We fly planes at high altitude, point cameras and different electronic surveillance devices onto Chinese territory to see what they're doing, to try to figure out what their response times might be to an aerial incursion, to trigger their radars, to figure out where their defenses are strongest and weakest, et cetera, et cetera. That's probing, that's surveillance, that is also normal defensive preparation for maybe a conflict with another major military power happens. How do we prepare ourselves for that eventuality? China, on the other hand, objected strenuously for years to this kind of surveillance and intensified those objections in the months before this famous encounter with a P-3 spy plane and a Chinese fighter aircraft. What happens is when China sees these aircraft, it sends up fighters to intercept them and tell them this is near Chinese airspace, go away. I'm sorry, I'll tell the short version of the story. Yes, thank you all for your patience. So they collided with the US spy plane. The plane was forced to land on Chinese territory at an emergency. And then China had US crew and sensitive military stuff in their possession. And we said, may we please have our crew back? May we please have our plane back? They said, you need to apologize for resulting in the death of a Chinese pilot and the loss of our aircraft, and because you were poking around in our business. The US went back and forth with this. They eventually released the crew. They disassembled the plane and sent it, like shipped it back to us in boxes after, I'm sure, cleaning as much knowledge as they could have. And the US issued a not quite apology expression of regrets. And so because we regretted that, we got our stuff back. But the lesson was that China was willing to get confrontational with a much stronger military power for purposes of pushing back on this activity that they didn't like. And there was a change in the frequency and the kind of closeness with which the US conducted those flights following that. A reduction in tension resulted from that. It's not to say that we can't conduct surveillance flights, but the frequency, intensity, and abrasiveness of the activity was deliberately dialed down following this. We are also now at a point of frequent, pretty intense, pretty predictable confrontations, this time mostly in the maritime space, but we've had aerial encounters recently where Chinese aircraft are flying within meters of US aircraft. So the danger level, I'd say, is high. The level of tension is dictated at the political level. So if we can work on reducing the political tensions over these issues that result in military friction, we can reduce the military friction. Following recent military to military dialogue between the US and China, they have reduced the aggressiveness of their interceptions of US surveillance flights. Because we were able to reestablish middle lines of communication and to have the Biden-Xi summit where they agreed on certain guardrails. That summit, that leader level engagement did change the intensity of those confrontations. So my lesson is the politics dictate the military friction.
Thank you.
My friend, I think this is one of the best lectures we have on campus. As I said, this is a very timely topic. Actually, I'm tricking you in a way that as if it is a lecture in the framework of China's rising, great power competition. Please prove me wrong. Actually, timely, I mean in the China's decline starting now. Within 5 years in the future, this topic will be once again popular. So I hope that we pay attention. And I promise that I will bring you back again here in the framework of the declining of China. That, as I said, I may be wrong, but in many cases, this is going to be a trend. So let's keep an eye on it. And I thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Jim. So on behalf of the Asian Center, please present to Jim as a token of appreciation. Once again, thank you very much. And I see you next time in the Asian World Center event. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all very much, sir.
Thank you, Rose.
I'm so happy that you could
How are
come.
you doing? Oh, good to see you.
I met you in those important moments.
Yeah, what a day. Yeah. Oh, you're on your feet.
I'm getting better.
Oh, let's take the time. Page next to it. That she did.
It's that
Like
one day water kid.
Yeah. No. Better safe than sorry. Oh, good. Yeah. In December, do you leave?
So let's talk about next.
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, I'll let you visit your
Thank you
friend.
so much.
Yeah, good to see you. Come by. Sorry I was late.
Thank you so much for coming. Okay.
Take
See you
care.
No, I had to go back. Details, please. And I'm retirement lawyer, so I was, when you retire, they ask you to continue to pay attention. And I enjoy it. The politics and everything. It's a very busy place right here. I'm sure. Thank you.
Have a good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
They responded quickly. Maybe I'm Mr. President. I need to put this on for myself too.
Okay, take this one.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Here, we'll get you this one.
Very well.
Business cards, if anybody wants business cards, here's my email. See you.
Yes, thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, very good.
Usually Chinese always say since Asian. And then we define.
I usually say something.
Just for the first. It's from this is not Chinese. I did it before 1991. So. That's more, that's it. They're always. Of course.
Yes.
They're-
Yes.
It's an event. Sometimes something. All of them agree.
That's right, can you believe it?
Yeah. And then deal with it.
The question I always said is now, to get, and I haven't had any recruits more Russia is one of the more enemy so within. And there were only two cases that identified, and it was 2000, but it's the same kind of internal affairs. It's really less on-ups. And the unions Trump will be more tough. It's
Could have there be four more
They don't accept any Russian.
but in the eyes of outside, we're going better with Chinese. There was a kind of a broke down notice without notice. I know.
So they were able to sort that out between them.
Well, I don't know if America is gonna be,
But it was a, goose
it's isolated.
goose and
But
Chinese.
Chinese see
Where they
lost
lost
weight
weight
from
that same
America coming to that.
measuring stick to.
But internally, economic not doing well.
Right, right.
In China.
Anyway, one of the things.
Since we're gonna push them out of WTO. And China is now getting ready, it's not.
All kinds of stuff all over the place. They had
To
to,
develop like.
the test on Korea, why did you run this semester? You learned how to sort out.
It's a strange.
So they ignored this.
Childish.
But to decide that they had to look up the rating. So they learned a whole lot more.
In China, I'm seeing.
Yeah, it's
The people.
proof that the world is crazy.
Leadership is
So I
just
find
like.
like very aware of this. Even say cockroach and say.
So I may be wrong,
I don't know that,
but I think that
It's
the
been very
trend
right
of
to ban
decline more than the rising China.
In a long,
Okay.
long time ago.
All right, have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
That's been a month.
Bye-bye.
Yes, good luck.
Oh, well, soon. I will.
Thanks.
I teach all the and the Asian politics. But next semester, Japanese. But the same party. With the part future in that. I don't see regional board, but I will see leadership on the international set. Brave enough.
It's the one, 2 blocks away down the street.
China is not.
So there's
These laws and.
economics and infrastructure and something, it's all.
Yeah, yes. China is in decline. Domestic.
When I was there, it was the part of student tax.
Not the center.
Marketplace go to outside, well,
Chinese cats, they put buildings on.
I was there. Those rational people.
That was the cast people.
Mixed trend down to the university. But,
It's.
It's a situation. No,
When the superpowers try to.
we're going that into the discussion.
It's always going to weaken balance. This is the time US systems, United States, China.
Why don't you take it to the national government just so
A little good time for both sides.
Oh,
So this is.
one of the parties. Flames.
It was a similar Yeah, so.
And the other 12 say, well, we're trying to calm him. This view was the one with the dotted lines.
That there is.
That's right, that's ours.
And this is unprecedented, and that will bring the United States much unexpected. The way I've experienced kind of think tank in Latin America, I don't know about the party wing.
Realize stuff.
White House.
It may still enough, that maybe I would bet that, but I don't think of it as that, as something.
They weren't presented, so relation not good, just like we have, both sides are not happy. Each side has its opinion. This is why I
Court of arbitration, the depth of means of settling these things.
decline.
She said, why don't we set up our own court here? That's not really what the haze is. You know, who else would join your court? Right, well, we're talking about both sides, needs that already exist. So,
This could be
so
safe,
it's not just
but I understand.
a court that's been arbitrarily set up.
The children and family with this story. Take
That
care
kind of,
people.
that's a mentality.
I actually heard people like this, Jimmy.
We didn't invent it, it's not.
Probably the biggest reason why China.
Listen, we weren't at the table when these things were sorted out, so we didn't have to reset. We're example.
Part of our, for another 20 years, China will remain with show muscle but not the fight. Because
Or at least be at the high table.
but this still won't project.
Only one under the
So
sun.
there's this one outside projection. At the same time, we don't need to project. It's deterrent.
In the slide.
They can go fight for it. But they are-
The middle.
Why?
Where you-
Male children of the family
Right,
have been the consequence of one child policy.
you use the word.
Has only one child. And these childs have to go to the military because the military need anyone is participate.
In other words,
And
they
they
say,
sacrifice.
walk 10 paces that way.
So that this
They're
is
short of daughters too.
Yes.
And then the daughters.
I wasn't clear.
Exactly. This is the incredible.
Next slide. You use the word failure.
And now the
It's
real.
failure from Chinese practice.
Yes.
To
Achieve,
We
change
basically
behavior.
You're not.
Yes, in your commentary.
It's good. Good. That's what, both, the US study was the US, right?
I'll go
These
these
are the way,
objectives also to individual people. But at the same time, we do not get wrong with our circumstances.
Access to
Concepts.
and military has tendency to be.
Yes, there are things that. So it's really had.
That's right. I still
We don't like each other, but we hate each other. We hate each other, we hate you. And that's like, that could be inside an airplane,
necessary.
you know? It's like, oh, we're in the airline, we don't like those guys. They don't like those guys. It's like, Republicans need anything done because they're gonna be left alone. And the Democrats need anything done, they would say, "Let's first."
Exactly. 10 years ago, we have not come theoretical. Now more and more, if you don't agree with me, I'm not going to vote.
And I want to try to
This is
understand the
it's not in America.
in
Used to
Yeah.
be, we disagree.
I walk miles with you to discuss our disagreement.
Yeah, but now we don't want to argue this. If you don't agree with me, we're not going to be around. That's very typical Chinese. Oh, yes. When Chiang Kai-shek was informed, the United Nations will accept China, the People's Republic of China, the Communist China,
I was not.
to be a member of the United Nations. China said, okay, we leave.
Information.
The moment he leaves,
As if it were
he never came back.
Why?
Why? Because he said, if you are in, I'm out. If I'm in,
In
you are
sixth
out.
grade, when we.
But you should coexisting. You can both live like Germany, East Germany, West Germany, South Korea, North Korea.
Class.
If you're in, I'm out. And then he was saying, so, that's what we said.
Yes,
My favorite.
yeah, I don't, yes, yes,
We
my.
are now, they have to become independent.
Yeah, this was fun, this was very fun.
Now,
I
totally.
appreciate you, coming out.
Oh,
Raising all this.
I'm gonna write down your name.
Oh,
If I'm- You can tell me 3 or 4 times and it won't work, that's all right.
Okay,
Tell me your name, Dr.
Moro, M-A-O. M-A-O-R-O-N-G, Moro. M-A-O-R-O-N-G, yeah, last name is G-S, yeah, M-A-O-R-O-N-G.
M-A-O-R-O.
Yeah. R-O-N-G.
Yeah, my phone's not gonna go on.
Okay, let me write.
Okay, I'll let you do it.
Okay, do that.
Go ahead.
M-A-O-R-N-A. Otherwise, I will be right there. O-N-G and then political science. Otherwise was political science for a long time and he retired.
50+ years. Hanging out at this place.
I retired from the military, did a couple other things, and went back and talked with the military, fucking another 22.5 years, so.
Oh,
I feel like I had 50 years of military service.
Where's,
I taught at a Air Force Base, from like 2002 till
oh,
this last year.
Make sure there were any issues.
I think we are good.
thank you so much.
Laura, did you stop the recording already?
Thank you so
Oh, I
much.
didn't.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Let me.
I was checking to see if there were any other things.
oh, wow, 69 to.
I think it's